Our next question for our Ask the Pastor series is, what does it mean to be Reformed? This is a question that I'm actually asked quite often. While we have a lot of Reformed churches in our area, I've lived places where there are not any at all. If I tell someone that I'm a Reformed pastor, I've gotten many different responses. I've even had people ask, what are you Reformed from? And I suppose if you aren't familiar with the Reformed Church, I'm sure that you would naturally hear the word Reformed with a lowercase r and assume that I had changed from something bad to something good. Well, I hope that I'm changing for the better all the time. When I say I am a Reformed pastor, it is most certainly with a capital R. To understand what it means to be Reformed starts with the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s. Martin Luther started the movement that caused different groups to break away from the Roman Catholic Church. At that time, there were a few different movements that were breaking away from the church, and in many respects, these different movements were geographical in nature. Lutherans were in the area that we would now call Germany, and the Reformed were in other parts of Europe, but primarily at this time in Switzerland. The Reformed and Lutheran movements did make an effort to unify, but there were some hang-ups on how each movement viewed the sacraments, and even though the two groups were united on most other doctrines, they couldn't get together because of the disagreements on the Lord's Supper and baptism. Now, that is all important historical information, but it doesn't really answer the question of what it means to be Reformed very well. The historical background tells us where we came from, but it doesn't do a very good job of helping us to understand what it means for us nearly 500 years later in rural Minnesota. To understand what it means to be Reformed, it is best to know what our confessions are. Christians who are Reformed hold first and foremost to the Bible as the only rule of faith and practice. But we also hold to creeds and confessions to help us understand what the Bible teaches. To start out with, we hold to the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and the Athanasian Creed. Now, you're likely familiar with the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed because we say them in church on a regular basis. But the Athanasian Creed, while being really important, it's really too long to be said together in unison in a worship service, and it's at least 3 times as long as the other 2 creeds, and the content and the way it is translated doesn't really lend itself to being said in worship. In addition to those creeds, we hold to what are known as the 3 forms of unity. These are 3 confessions from the Protestant Reformation. These are the Belgic Confession, the Canons of Dort, and the Heidelberg Catechism. Many of us are probably pretty familiar with the Heidelberg Catechism. Even if, like me, you didn't go to catechism classes when you were younger, chances are you've heard me reference the Heidelberg Catechism from the pulpit. It's that bright blue book I pull out and read from toward the end of the sermon every so often. There are also a few responsive readings in our new hymnals from the Heidelberg Catechism. The Belgic Confession is a confession that has statements about an assortment of doctrinal areas to help us know what we believe and why we believe it. It's a relatively short document that can be easily read in about 20 to 30 minutes if you were to just sit down and read it from beginning to end. The Belgic Confession was written as a summary of doctrine that the Reformed churches taught to help those who charged them of false teaching to see that what they were teaching wasn't false, but instead was in line with the teaching of Scripture. Even though the author of the confession made his arguments from Scripture, the confession didn't help him out because he was eventually martyred for teaching the Reformed faith. This happened during the Inquisition. Lastly, we have the Canons of Dort. Of the 3 forms of unity, it is likely the most difficult to understand because it's about a very specific topic that arose out of a conflict in the Netherlands. It's a relatively complex issue, but I'll do my best to make it easy to understand so you don't get sick of me talking about it and just click on something else and leave this video. The issue that was talked about in the Canons of Dort is centered primarily around what the Reformed Church should teach regarding predestination and election. A group back then, known as the Remonstrants, came out with 5 statements, and in response, the churches gathered for the Synod of Dort in order to respond to these 5 points. The response that we find in the Canons of Dort have come to be known as the 5 points of Calvinism. Even though John Calvin was long dead by the time these 5 points were put together, they're named after him. The 5 points have been summarized with an acronym. It's known as TULIP. And I'm going to do my best to explain this acronym quickly. The T stands for total depravity. People are born dead in trespasses and sins. Because of this, they are incapable of saving themselves. The U in TULIP stands for unconditional election. God elects us not because of anything that we have done or anything we will do, but instead saves us by his grace. The L stands for limited atonement and is the most controversial of the 5 points. Personally, I'm not that big a fan of the word limited in this capacity here because it makes it seem as though we're limiting God's work in saving us. I think a better word for what is being taught here is intentional or particular atonement. Basically, what we're saying here with limited atonement is that Jesus died to save a specific group of people and that his saving work is not applied to those who will not be saved. In other words, Jesus died to save the saved, not to make all people savable. The I in TULIP stands for irresistible grace. This means that if we are elected by God and he calls us, we will have faith. Lastly, the P stands for perseverance of the saints. This means that God has elected you and called you by his grace. He will keep you in the faith. The word perseverance here does not mean that we are doing the persevering. God is the one who keeps us in the faith. He saves us by his own doing, and he will keep us in him. Now that's a lot to digest. I'll try to sum it up as best as I can. Like all confessional Protestants, we have our origin in the 1500s during the Protestant Reformation. This means that we are Christians who believe that God saves us solely by his grace alone, through faith alone, on account of the work of Christ alone. We are declared righteous because of what Jesus has done for us in his perfect life, death, resurrection, and ascension. And this is all because we understand that we were born dead in our sin, and dead people do not raise themselves. We need God to come to us and resurrect us to newness of life. Now that is something that all confessional Protestants affirm, but not all of us are called Reformed. For example, we have nearly everything in common with Presbyterians, but instead of adhering to the 3 forms of unity, they have the Westminster Standards. They would not object to anything in the 3 forms of unity, but they have a different set of confessions. As for confessional Lutherans, we would have much of the same view on the doctrine of justification by faith alone, through grace alone, and several other doctrines for that matter. But we differ primarily in the area of the sacraments. This is just a basic overview of what it means to be Reformed, but hopefully it gives you some points of conversation if the question ever comes up again.